Welcome to the podcast, everyone. I'm here with Anand Hira, a venture partner of IBOS Ventures. And today we're going to discuss ethics in startups. This is particularly timely because of the recent Theranos trial with Elizabeth Holmes. And we're going to kind of focus in on the tight line that startup founders have it when it comes to faking it until you make it. So, Anand, thanks again for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Glad to be back as a second-time guest now. Thank you for having me.
Well, we always like your insights. I mean, as long as you keep being insightful, it's always a great thing.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll do my best for sure.
No worries. I mean, this is a timely topic, right? We've seen the recent conviction of and conclusion of the Theranos trial, and I think there's been in my time in the startup community, and probably in your time in the community, there's that fake it till you make it mentality, right? We all know that we're building on limited funds. We're trying to reach a minimum viable product, and sometimes you have to embellish a bit. But where do you see that fake it till you make it cross into maybe more unethical behavior, or where does it or maybe a different way of phrasing the question, where's some areas when you're pitching that you have to tell the truth, whether it's to your customers, your investors, or even your employees?
Sure. No, great question, Eric. And yes, very topical. I will add that I'm also a founder of Zycara, not just a venture partner at IBOS. So I definitely have both sides, both perspectives on this topic. For me, when I think I'd like to just kind of start off with framing the context of where startup founders and investors are coming from when it comes to fake it till you make it, and kind of the narratives around that. Basically, if you look at the landscape, you have your early stage startups, early stage founders who are pre-customers, typically maybe at an MVP level, like you mentioned, and the pitch that they can provide is on the future potential, right? And then as you move upstream to seed, series A, B, C, D, E, F, G, it moves more towards, okay, what are the projections, right? And where's the opportunity to keep leveling up and scaling in terms of from the present customer base to how do we reach, the market potential. And then on the investor side, there are investors who focus on each of these areas as well. And their incentive is obviously to return capital to their investors and their partners. So just keeping that context in mind, when I kind of look at how a founder, as an investor, when I look at how a founder kind of presents points in their presentation in response to particular questions, where I kind of draw the line is when you're talking about the future, that's exactly what it is. It's the future. So my expectation is this is the picture that this founder sees of where their potential is down the road. And then, yeah, of course, like I said, that relates to the product, their projections of customers, and so on and so forth. Where I kind of draw the line is when there's a direct question asked about the current state of affairs of a business in terms of where they're at from a revenue, customer, or product capability perspective. And to kind of double click on that, it's more of, if you say you have 100 customers today, do you really have 100 customers today, and not 50 trial users or 20 people in your pipeline plus 30 customers, and so you're aggregating all of them as customers? That's one thing where I feel it should be delineated by a founder, and I would expect the founder to kind of delineate things that way. And then in terms of the product, it gets a little bit trickier and more nuanced. That I think making a representation of where the product is going to be in the near future or distant future, I kind of give a little bit more room on that aspect. I feel like it turns more back on me to decipher whether the current state of the product and the team behind it is demonstrating a potential capability of reaching the necessary milestones along the way to kind of hit that vision of the product or service. So that's kind of where I draw the line, is the representation of today versus tomorrow.
It's interesting that you bring that up. It's that that future vision versus where it is today. But you kind of gave yourself a little bit of gray space there when you mentioned the product, right?
Sure.
Because you kind of mentioned near future and future. So if you know, from a founder perspective, I can see a lot of people who are um, thinking, well, near future in my perspective for my product is a year or two,
Sure.
and for an investor, it might be 6 to 10 months down the road. How do you, in some respects, delineate what is near future and future? And I mean, how, or let me rephrase, how do you reconcile your version of near future and future with that of the startup founder using your investor hat, and then also vice versa from the startup founder perspective?
Sure. I think it all revolves around communication, the specifics
Mhm.
of it. So from an investor hat, it's when I ask, like, when is the next level up or evolution of the current state of the product? It's a direct question. And so that's where I would say, I'd expect a reasonable estimation of this is what we need to do. And to get more specific, like I would request more details on, okay, we need to do X, Y, Z, or we need to hire X to bring things to this state. And then I, as an investor, will take that as, okay, it's not of certainty. And then it's on me to kind of price that risk or incorporate that level of risk based on what the founder is telling me of the next milestone of the approximation of that. It's the reason I kind of gave myself some room there is because, goals and targets are they're just that. So it becomes a little tricky. But for me, it's on the explanation of the founder in terms of how they're going to get there. That matters
Mhm.
more than, actually whether they actually get to that target, because, I'm going to invest today. Obviously, my goal is for them to get there. So I'll do what I can as an investor to help them get to that point as well. So it's on me in that sense as well. But really, again, it's in the details of what they communicate that I take literally, in terms of evaluating what a founder says about where they're at from a product perspective. And then as a founder, on the other side of the coin, it's really important to be, for me, and I, most of the founders I know, it's really to be about, to be as truthful as possible, but to create that excitement and conviction around what we're going to deliver. It requires, a bit of, I don't want to say massaging, but a bit of overpromising when you're at the capital seeking stage. We do have to overpromise. And then, when they do turn to your investors, it kind of switches a little bit the other way towards, under promising again, and then trying to over deliver. But ultimately, it's all in your, personal set of ethics. Like, yes, we're in a very competitive environment and we have a goal and we need to raise this capital. But, I draw the line of not saying something that I have no concrete path that I can describe to an investor to get to that stage of the product or of the company.
Hmm.
So it's really, for me, about, can I detail and give validity to that detail around how to get there?
It's very interesting because I think in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years, we've seen an influx of both new startup founders who don't have any previous startup experience at all, plus also new investors, right? Whether they're angels or going for larger funds, etc. And you could argue in some respects it's a wild west, but it sounds like from your description, there's a lot of due diligence that but both sides need to do, right? And not just from a startup founder's ethics perspective or an investor's understanding of product technology, but their understanding of what they're getting themselves involved in. Do you think we do a good job in terms of educating people? I mean, we have a lot of accelerators. I know we are starting to see a lot of venture capital universities and education. Are we failing on that perspective? And this is kind of how we got ourselves into this fake it till you make it ethos in Silicon Valley startup culture.
Great question. The thing is, I right now everything is driven by the influx of capital, especially over the last couple of years. I mean, we're talking exponential growth on both sides, right? When there's exponential capital, there's exponential people seeking that capital. And so things have moved in a very aggressive manner on both sides because of that. And investors are eager and aggressive to deploy capital, and founders are eager and aggressive to take that capital and turn it into their vision. I would say on the education front, it's something there's always room for improvement when it comes to the education system at large, and then to bring that back down to the startup ecosystem. I think there's a lot of great content out there that's ubiquitously shared, at least from my experience, when it comes to I think today, now more than ever, it's a lot easier to identify, okay, what do I need to do at this stage of being a first-time founder? What do I need to do next? And there's a lot of content around what are the kind of expectations on both ends, even as an investor. I've recently received a number of emails for not only startup education platforms or startup like you said, a lot of mini accelerators. Maybe not the big brands, because those have been around for a while, but a lot of micro brands on that front, and a lot more early VC, like trying to get into VC type education content. Maybe it's because of my, the algorithms are aware of what I'm kind of searching and doing, but I see a lot of it. And so I don't think for anyone who's seeking that knowledge, and this goes beyond startups, honestly, today, I think it's easier to accomplish anything you want by just putting in a little bit of time in research and trying to find that information than it ever has been. Where I think it becomes it's more challenging today isn't just based on the fact that now everyone is armed with a lot more information or access to that information. So, the arbitrage of information is becoming more and more reduced. But I think we do a good job. I think what we could do better is forming more sets of standards around guidance for founders, in terms of not just the practical implementation steps of becoming a founder and running a company, but on the terms of ethics, in how to kind of look at things and why it's important, and how to kind of get the same message across without necessarily having to stretch the truth to where it becomes a lie. So, different things like that, where I think we could have more, tech leaders create more content and narrative around these topics, where I think just driving home the point, where a lot of these, maybe, writing a book, a lot of these things could kind of spread their wings within the ecosystem, because I do think information sharing is at a, all-time high, and it's going to continue that way within the ecosystem.
You bring up two very interesting points, which are on a probe on. So the first one is, I think we're at a stage where, to your point, we're so decentralized, right? Information sharing is at an all-time high. And it's not just impacted Silicon Valley, it's throughout every single industry. So at a high level, do you think Silicon Valley has been unfairly tarred with that fake it till you make it? I mean, to your point, information is freely available. You can do this in any industry if you really think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, honestly, even the fake it till you make it, just ethos in general, I think it's part of just human conditioning, to be honest. So I think it's originated from the dawn of mankind. I'm sorry, my dog is actually having a nightmare right now. Apologies.
All good.
So, and what I mean by that is, look, incentives drive human behavior, right? And so anytime someone is seeking capital, they're going to stretch the truth. And then when someone is stretching the truth, a peer looks at it and says, well, if they're doing this and they had a successful outcome, then I need to be doing this to be able to hit that successful outcome as well. And so I think it's just natural, but I think and I do think Silicon Valley specifically gets mislabeled as kind of propagating this. Case in point, even with the Theranos trial or case, There weren't any major Silicon Valley investors or any really of note. It was, military generals and very aged individual investors. I don't mean anything by that, but I think that because the money and the attention is in Silicon Valley, that it gets this label, and to a degree, it's fair. That is the hub of where a lot of the attention and kind of exposure to the upstart companies comes from. But I do think that the behavior and the dynamics are just how human incentives lie when it comes to capitalist, economies or anything where there's competition for anything, for something specifically like capital, of course.
Yeah, and you have a great way this podcast is segueing into my next question. So I'm really happy about this. So like I said, this kind of leads into my second question. It's like, what can society or actors do to kind of maybe put more ethics into or reduce this fake it till you make it, if it's human nature? I think you already alluded to, maybe we should be helping startup founders and investors think of maybe a code of ethics, right? I went from financial services. I think of the CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst. They're, I think it's an entire book, if I remember correctly, that's all in ethics, right? Do you think it's more about self-governance and providing that information, like you kind of allude to, whether it's people writing a book, et cetera? Or do you think we need to lean towards government regulation, which the current administration seems to be leaning towards on a number of different fronts, which is a completely different discussion. So let's keep it within ethics right now.
Sure. I think I personally come from the view of self-governance, and the ecosystem should take care of it in terms of any issues that come in within, especially in the tech space or any industry at large. Self-governance and accountability within is the way to go from my perspective, because anytime you start introducing friction points, then the accessibility again becomes, which is another topic in terms of exclusion, becomes more of an issue. So, while from what I understand, the accreditation laws are being a topic related on the investor front, whether to expand it, create a test, or put more scrutiny on it in terms of, because of the growth of crowdfunding platforms, to put more restrictions, because people are putting more and more of their hard-earned savings and capital into the space. And so whether they should be protected or not, I come from the view of, if we're allowing gambling in Las Vegas without any restriction, then investing in a company, no matter the risk of an absolute zero or home run, I think the standard should be equal on that front in terms of personal choice. So I don't think more government intervention or regulation is really healthy. I just think it's going to create more exclusion of opportunity to invest. And looking from within the venture space, I mean, there's a reason why there's an influx of capital. The returns are, phenomenal, in the sense that relative to public markets, a lot of the value capture is in the earlier stages. And so if we're trying to bring people out of, the lower middle class to the middle class and help progress society, I think the least amount of regulation in the space is going to be the way to go to kind of promote that, to facilitate that.
And I think that aligns with my views. So if it's not necessarily government regulation, what do you think investors and startup founders can do individually? Obviously, it's going to be based on their own personal code of ethics, but I'm sure there's some additional thoughts you have in terms of how they can better arm themselves or protect themselves or be more ethical in this space. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think from a founder perspective, I think the burden is on the investor front more, but just to touch on the founder front, I think it's really a matter of just looking at just looking at the kind of peer network and seeing that, there are boundaries, and I think coming up with an accountability partner or a peer can kind of help keep an individual more grounded and stable. And, again, I'm just a little bit more philosophical and in terms of just lifestyle choice, but I think founders just have an obligation to look themselves in the mirror and say, like, am I going down a path of hurting another person, like consciously by saying XYZ? Or have I just, put things out there in terms of, this is, I strongly believe in this, and ultimately I will get there, as long as they have that own self-reflection of being able to look themselves kind of in the mirror and not being, and this gets a little tricky, but not being delusional about what they're promoting or saying, then I think that's where the buck stops with the founders. And ultimately, I think it all really, like, not at all, but 80% of it comes on the investor side, because they're the ones who are actually breeding the behavior more and more with the incentives that have been kind of going in the wrong direction as of late. You have more and more later stage investors moving, downstream and investing in, or upstream and moving into, series, like the late series stage investing, to even now, seed and pretty soon pre-seed. And when they do that, they have so much capital, and their portfolio models account for the cost of doing business, which is, essentially the failures, and that's already been baked in. And then when you incorporate, the smaller percentage of blatant fraud to justify them not doing enough due diligence, I think that's where it comes down to how much they value their reputation, right, over time. And so to actually take that a step back, to look at it from a different perspective, I think a lot of the burden can fall, or should fall, on the LPs themselves who fund these venture firms. Because as long as, I was thinking about this from personal experience during, in the public equity markets, and from IBOS and our team's experience in the real estate space during the '08 crash, right? A lot of the firms had absolute conviction in their, in their mortgage-backed models, and didn't obviously foresee until it was a little late of what was to come, right? And so if venture portfolio models are trying to account for the risk of less and less due diligence because they're, all in an aggressive competition to deploy capital, then LPs need to be aware of what may come from that behavior. And so I think LPs should start asking more and more questions before they commit more and more dollars. And I think that will help kind of at least, subdue the pace at which capital is being thrown aggressively with less and less diligence. And then that will then reverberate down to the founders, who have to undergo more diligence, right? So I think it's a very interesting dynamic in play. But, having just on the spot thought through it, I think LPs can have a huge impact on the future outcomes before, these models start going the wrong direction. And, we have albeit not as large as the financial crisis, but a sub-crisis within the community.
And I think you hit the nail on the head in your description, right? It at the end of the day, no matter how much regulation or technology or automation you throw at this situation, at the end of the day, is about, for lack of a better term, human frailty, right? It's how we interact with each other, how we view each other, and it makes it kind of tricky, to be perfectly blunt.
It really is. I mean, I've given like very lengthy and nuanced answers because it's really hard to define. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at in terms of where things can go from here. I really think it's trending in the wrong direction, but the burden kind of comes from the source of capital to kind of course correct. So
makes sense. As always, and as I'm sure you're aware, any further final thoughts? This has been a great conversation, by the way.
Thank you, Eric. Overall, I would say, this issue of fraud coming from the fake it till you make it, topic is not as alarming as it may have sounded in terms of the volume of it going on, but it is getting to levels where, I know for us and other firms that we kind of work with or have discussions around, that diligence is becoming more and more lengthy, and we are seeing a lot more exaggeration in numbers by founders, and so we have to put in a little bit more, add a couple layers of questioning before we can get to the right answer. But then again, that's a part of doing business in the space. But I think everything is very vibrant overall and very healthy. Public markets are course correcting, which will obviously affect valuations, which will then slow down the interest from capital and founders. So we'll see how that shakes out. But overall, I think innovation's in a great place. And we have a lot to be excited about in the near term.
100% agree, Adnan. Well, thank you again for joining the podcast, and everyone else, stay tuned for our next episode.